So good morning. Today we are going to discuss the discourse ethics of Jürgen Habermas. Now, Jürgen Habermas is a German critical theorist. He has background both in philosophy and in sociology. As a philosopher, he comes very much close to Kant. He can be said to be falling in line with the Kantian tradition, especially when it comes to morality. He takes inspiration from Kant, but goes beyond Kant and develops his ideas even more in detail and more in a nuanced way. As a sociologist, he comes in the school called the Frankfurt School or the School of Critical Theory. Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, they were the founders of this school. Mostly it is a very important school challenging some of the paradigms of the society of that time with a certain Marxian analysis. Not entirely Marxian, they move away from Marx as well, but they do have a certain Marxian analysis in their thinking. Habermas belongs to the second generation of the critical theory school, or what is known as the Frankfurt School, named after the place Frankfurt in Germany, where the school was originally founded. Now, let us try and understand basically some of his ideas in morality. As I told you, Habermas is a Kantian, especially when it comes to morality. So he takes the project of enlightenment very seriously. Kant was no doubt an enlightenment philosopher. When we speak about the enlightenment philosopher, basically what we are referring to is a philosopher who lays emphasis on the importance of the use of reason. You may recall that for Kant, reason is very important in making moral judgments, of course along with the goodwill. So reason is, however, fundamental. You cannot be swayed away by emotions. Your morality must be such that it is reasonable to the extent that you may be able to universalize it. So that is the key of enlightenment. Kant has a very specific definition of what enlightenment means. For him, as I have given in the PowerPoint, I quote, enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. Man has somehow imposed on himself a certain immaturity over the period of time. And enlightenment is an attempt to move away from this immaturity, which you yourself have imposed on yourself. It is not somebody has imposed on you. Now, what is this immaturity? Basically, it means your inability to use your own understanding without the guidance of others. In other words, Kant thought the pre-enlightenment man hesitates to use his own reason, his own understanding. He always needs to rely on somebody's guidance to make choices, decisions, and judgments. Now, with enlightenment, you need to move away from this. Move away from this particular aspect of not being able to be dependent on others and being able to make your own decision based on your own understanding. If you remember, the enlightenment motto is dare to know, or have the courage to know. So immaturity is your refusal to accept to use your reason, and that you have imposed on yourself. Now Habermas continues this project. Therefore, for Habermas, the use of reason is very crucial. It's very significant. So unless and otherwise you use reason in your morality cannot be something which is of enlightenment project or the continuation of the enlightenment project. However, Habermas is not all that positive about enlightenment. He also has a strong critique against against the Enlightenment. He says, though Enlightenment has a true purpose of freeing human person from the self-incurred immaturity, somehow the Enlightenment has turned against itself. The whole point of the Enlightenment is to free people through the use of reason. But unfortunately, instead of freeing people through the use of reason, it has degenerated into a modern form of barbarism. It is a modern form of barbarism because Enlightenment, instead of liberating people, freeing people, has ended up exerting control and domination over oneself, others, and the nature. So instead of becoming people who are free through the proper use of reason, we have become slaves to our own selves in some way, and we have also enslaved others, and we have also enslaved the nature. Habermas points to an important aspect. Reason can be wrongly used. Instead of the liberating potential, it can be used for an enslaving purpose or an oppressive purpose, which is not very difficult for us to understand, because people do justify, people do use arguments based on reason for the domination they have over others or over themselves, a kind of enslavement of oneself or the domination over nature. So it is the post-enlightenment that has led to this, according to Habermas. Though the original purpose is to free or emancipate, liberate the human person through the use of reason, it has gone against itself. Therefore, Habermas thinks there is a need to nuance Kantian morality. How do we nuance it? Kant somehow thought reason, by its very definition, is one singular reality. If it is reason, it should be the same for you and for me, irrespective of where we are born, where we are socialized, where we are raised. Habermas thinks there is some problem here. This understanding of reason is very Eurocentric. This understanding of reason understands reason only from the point of view of the Western society or the European society. Therefore, you think whether this is what I would reasonably consider to be morally permissible. If I consider through the use of my reason as morally permissible, then I must be able to universalize it. So there is only a monologue. You talk to yourself about the validity of the moral norm through the use of reason, of course. And then you see whether it can be made universal. And that is how exactly Kant did. But for Habermas, such reasoning for the validity of moral norms cannot be done all by yourself in a monological way, just by talking to yourself. You should have a dialogical approach. Therefore, it should be done through proper communication with others. Habermas calls this a communicative action, a communication between different stakeholders, participants, that leads us to moral action. Hence, all moral norms are to be validated only through communicative action. Habermas makes a distinction between communicative action and a strategic action. Now, this distinction is very important and very crucial. Oftentimes, people use strategic action to reach the end goal. Habermas thinks that is not the right approach. We should adopt a communicative action. Let us try and understand what this means for us, strategic action and communicative action. Strategic action reinforces existing system. It reinforces existing system by the use of certain strategies, certain techniques. Like for example, we have certain system in place. One of the things that is operative in a system is that we try to reinforce the system in order to achieve our end goals. Let's say, for example, you want to make sure that there is no protest anywhere. In order to ensure there is no protest, what do? You make use of the strategy. You make use of the strategy to impose the 144 curfew so that you don't want the protest to happen. This is exactly the way in which you reinforce the system. This is the strategic action. Now, this is normally, in the strategic action, actions are coordinated not through linguistic media, not through communication, talking to one another, but through non-linguistic media. This non-linguistic media includes the power of the state, which I gave the example right now, that you use your power to control any uprising, any revolt, any protest, and also the money market. You silence people sometimes by giving them some kind of welfare. You give them some money. You buy them. And oftentimes this happens powerfully in today's society. You don't just buy the people, but you also buy the propagandists, buy the very media that would be a propaganda for you. So this is how the strategic action works according to Habermas. In contrast, the communicative action reinvents the life world. Reinventing the life world would mean the life world is the situation in which we all live. And communicative action constantly tries to make this particular life world, which you and I share, a better one for us to constantly remain in communication. That's the meaning of reinventing. So reinventing means it does exist. You are not inventing anything new, but then you are every time making it fresh, making it anew through proper communication. Life world basically for Habermas implies the power that the participants have. Now, participants would mean all those people who are involved in a particular communication. Suppose you and I have something, we are the stakeholders, so we talk about it, we discuss about it. So for example, in a political system, a particular municipal ward would mean that all the members of the municipal ward are the participants. And they should be empowered. They should have the power to interpret their surrounding and to coordinate the action. So it is not that one person interprets for them and then he uses the strategy to make sure that everybody does that. No. Every participant is empowered. So you see there is a dialogical issue that is coming. Now Habermas is very clear with regard to this dialogical approach. In fact, his morality is built on the principle of dialogical democracy, which is very political in nature. So therefore, all the participants are empowered to interpret the world they live in, their surrounding world. World here would mean the social context in which they live, not just the physical world, but the social world, in order to coordinate their actions. Habermas tries to integrate two knowledge disciplines: philosophy, by bringing in the idea of reason, and sociology, by bringing the idea of coordinating actions for social unity. So that is how Habermas becomes very creative in his approach to morality. Habermas says we live in a pluralistic society. That is the reason why we need to engage in this dialogical approach. We don't live in a monoculture or uniculture. There are people from different cultures, and our society is pluralistic. It's no longer one singular cultural group that lives in isolation. We constantly interact with one another. And therefore, it is important for us that we are aware of others' points of view and the way they interpret the life world. And that is possible only when we participate in a discourse. Now, one of the things that you need to remember is a word like discourse is philosophically loaded term, though we may commonly use this word. Different philosophers use this word in different ways with different meanings. For Habermas, discourse has a specific meaning. Discourse for him means a dialogical form of practical reason for the validation of norm. Now, dialogical form that I have explained to you so far, so all the participants must be able to talk to one another, dialogue with each other, so that we know the perspectives of other participants and the interpretations of the life world they have. So it is not just I reason out all by myself in isolation, I try to make it universal, as Kant thought, but it is by dialoguing with others. But this dialogue involves what he calls a practical reason, which is different from a theoretical reason. And the purpose of the practical reason is the validation of a norm. Now, the distinction between theoretical reason and the practical reason is this. This is a Kantian distinction. Habermas has simply taken this from Kant. Theoretical reason basically tries to establish the truth of the propositions, whether this proposition, this statement is true or not. Whereas practical reason tries to establish the rightness of the norm, whether this particular norm, this law, is morally right or not. So there is a different approach in your reasoning. When you are reasoning about theoretical matters, whether it is true that God exists, whether it is true that the sun is at the center, not the earth, whether is it true that the world began a few billion years ago. Now, these are theoretical reasons. It doesn't say anything about this. Any of this statement has nothing to do with morally right or wrong. These are mere factual statements of theories. That's why they are theoretical reason. So, when you have a theoretical reason, you are only trying to know whether the statement that is made is true or not. You are trying to establish its truth or its falsity. Whereas practical reason tries to establish the rightness of norms. The rightness of norms would mean there are norms like do not murder. Is it right to say do not murder? Now that would be a practical reason. Do not steal. Is it right to say do not steal? Is the norm right? The norm of not stealing, is it a right norm? Or it's not a right norm, it is wrong perhaps. Like we have a lot of norms that probably we don't agree with, we consider them wrong. Certain norms we agree with, we consider them right. So our practical reason tries to establish whether these norms are right or whether these norms are wrong, whereas theoretical reasons are trying to establish whether these propositions are true or they are false. So that is the difference between theoretical reason and this is a Kantian distinction, by the way. And then Habermas takes this idea and then says, therefore discourse for him is not meant for any theoretical purpose. Discourse has a specific meaning. It is a dialogue of practical reason about the rightness of rightness or the wrongness of the norm. It is because discourse, the purpose of the discourse to arrive at the validity of the norms we have. And that arriving at the validity is done collectively, not by myself alone, but by dialoguing with others. So Habermas says you can validate a norm or justify a norm only if everybody involved in the discourse has agreed to that norm through the use of reason. Again, they agree to the norm not because they like it, they are passionate about it, they are emotionally swayed away by it, but because they make use of the proper reasoning and then they agree to it. Only then the norm can be validated, it can be justified. Now for Habermas, it is not merely the outcome that is important. Finally, well, the outcome is that everybody agrees. Now that would be typically a strategic action. A strategic action always looks at the end result. Everybody agrees. Somehow you have to make sure everybody agrees. So you make use of some strategies, by either buying them or by coaxing them or by forcing them or indirectly threatening them, all these things. That is the end goal, end result. That's why most political leaders try to do that. But for Habermas, what is equally important or even perhaps more important is the deliberation process. The process by which you arrive at this agreement. It is not enough that you arrive at the agreement. What kind of process is involved to arrive at an agreement through the use of reason, which we call the reasoned agreement? For him, it has 4 conditions. There should be the absence of power abuse. You cannot try to abuse your power to make sure people come to an agreement. No, that would be wrong. That would be a wrong deliberation process, and that is not going to be a discourse at all. Because a discourse is basically a dialogue of practical reason. It is not a dialogue of force, a dialogue of pressure. No, people should be free to use their reason without you forcing them to do that in order to validate the norm. So there cannot be any power abuse. Oftentimes in our today modern world, there is a lot of power abuse because of the unequal social situation, obviously. Secondly, there should be what he calls the egalitarian reciprocity. Suppose if there are majority group in that particular group of participants, one group is majority, culturally or otherwise. Now, they should not be overpowering the rest of them. Now, this is very important because this can often happen, So, the majority can impose their views and then they can silence the others. So, there should be some system of egalitarian. Everybody should be treated in the equal way. So, it should be in a reciprocal way, not only from one side to the other, but every quarter should pay attention to that, of this principle of equality and the equal participation. That means no majority overpowering. Thirdly, voluntary self-ascription. People must be free to join the particular group of dialogue. So, you cannot force me to be part of the discourse. I must freely accept to be part of the discourse. So I am voluntarily ascribing myself to be part of the participants in order to engage in a discourse of practical reason for the validation of moral norm. And finally, in as much as I am free to join the group, I am also free to exit from the group. So I don't no longer ascribe myself to the group, but I exit from my self-ascription. So these are the conditions that are important. These 4 conditions are important in the deliberation process. Even if one of the conditions is lost, then this is no longer a communicative action. Then it falls back into strategic action. Now Habermas comes up with 3 principles of discourse ethics. Now let us look at these three principles. The first principle is called the principle of universalization. This is similar to Kant's principle of universalization, but with a major difference. The universalization here would imply that our discourse must set conditions for impartial judgment. If it has to set conditions for impartial judgment, then there should be something of my perspective that I must be willing to give up, in as much as others are willing to give up something of their perspectives. So it lays constraint on the perspectives of different people so that finally we can come to an impartial judgment. So we try to bring about the balancing of interests, because you have got certain interests because you belong to a particular group. I have got some interests because I belong to a particular group. So there are some constraints that are laid to the perspectives of all of us so that we can arrive at an impartial judgment. In other words, it is somehow, are we able to give up certain perspectives of ours and rise above that so that we can reach at an impartial judgment aimed at universalization. Universalization is possible only if you give up something and I give up something. There is a mutual way in which we try to negotiate certain perspectives that we give up. Suppose if you have a very hard perspective on something, very closed perspective on something, you are not willing to give up at all. In the first place, there is no dialogue possible. So dialogue is possible only with a certain open mind, that it is possible that some of my perspectives may not be acceptable, and maybe I may have to revisit it. So also everybody in the group, not only me, but everybody. So it is a condition for the impartial judgment. So universalization is not merely I asking whether I consider this morally permissible through the use of my reason, so I can apply to everybody. No. So I take somehow the perspectives of everyone, but also at the same time trying to give some constraints to the perspectives of everyone in the balancing of interests of everyone, so that we can make an impartial judgment. The second condition is consensus. Consensus in simple terms would mean agreement. According to Habermas, moral norms can be said to be valid. If something can be moral norm and we want to consider them valid, only if it meets, or at least in principle could meet, the approval of all the participants in the discourse. So otherwise the norm is not valid. It is somehow there should be an agreement. If not for this agreement, then it may not be considered valid norm. The last principle is the principle of freedom. The principle of freedom states the participants must be able to participate in the discourse freely. Now, this principle of freedom contains within itself the four conditions that I said a while ago. In other words, there cannot be abuse of power here, there cannot be majority overpowering, and people must be able to freely join and freely exit, and also they freely accept the consequences of observing a norm, even if it is controversial, so that there is a satisfaction of the interest of each individual is possible. So these are the three principles of discourse ethics. The third principle, the freedom, is very much related to the four conditions of discourse that I spoke a while ago, which also you have in the previous slide. To conclude, discourse ethics basically has one singular goal: to coordinate our actions through consensus. Consensus means agreement. So now we should be careful that Habermas is speaking about consensus, but it doesn't mean that there is no place for disagreement here or dissensus here. He uses a particular German word, Einverständnis, which means people agree that something should be the case. and another word, Verständigung, which means a mutual understanding. The word Habermas uses is not Einverständnis, but Verständigung, which means a mutual understanding. A mutual understanding implies that we can agree to disagree. There can be disagreements among us. We can even agree on that. That means there is also a possibility of disagreement in the consensus that we have, in the agreement we have. It's normally known as the consensus in the dissensus. So this is what Habermas speaks about generally, the discourse ethics. I have tried to sum up the key points. I'm sure there would be some questions that you may have. So I will now end this presentation so we can have some question and answers. Thank you very much.